Originally, Beowulf was an oral poem, which means that it was told from memory and passed along from person to person, from tribe to tribe, and from generation to generation. It was told at social gatherings, dinners, and weddings, and parties, and other celebrations, and it was told by trained storytellers and ordinary people alike. Oral poetry is a form of vernacular art that is made by and for ordinary people as part of their everyday lives. Oral poetry uses simple, everyday language that anyone could understand, even when it's telling an extraordinary story. And this is exactly what the Beowulf poem is, an extraordinary story told by people in Anglo-Saxon society as part of their everyday lives. Anyone could tell a story from memory, but some people were better at it than others. And the best storytellers of all were the Shopes, the Anglo-Saxon oral poets. Each tribe had a Shope, and the Shope was its entertainer and historian. He would recite his stories from memory, often accompanying himself with a lyre, which is a small stringed instrument similar to a harp. You will remember from the previous podcast that Anglo-Saxon society was a fraternal society, that there was a close bond between the warriors, that they lived together, they fought together, and they died together. If you look at the image on your screen, you will see that the Shope is illustrated in red, and he's standing amongst the men gathered around the fire. The king is on the far left, and he and the other warriors have their attention focused on the Shope. The Shope would tell stories of legends from the past and sing about the news of the present day, including battles and the deeds of members of the tribe. The Shope stories often had a moral component to them, offering models of good behavior to which the warriors could aspire, and offering models of bad behavior that they were to avoid. In this way, the Shope was instrumental in the creation of a fraternal bond among the members of the tribe. It is important to understand that precisely because he could offer models of positive and negative behavior, unify the tribe, and immortalize the brave deeds of its members in stories that could be passed along from person to person, tribe to tribe, and generation to generation, the Shope enjoyed a position of immense power, prestige, and respect in Anglo-Saxon society. His ability with language, his skill with words, was considered as important as any warrior's skill with a sword, and just as manly. In the Beowulf poem, the Shope becomes a character in his own story, and we will see time and again that the story he tells is one of the power of language. Beowulf was an oral poem, which means that it was similar to a game of telephone. Each time that it was retold, it changed a little, and over time, it changed a lot. If you've ever played telephone as a kid, you know exactly how this works. You whisper something to a friend's ear, and then she whispers what she's heard into another friend's ear. That friend passes it along to another friend, and so on down the line, so that what the last person hears is only remotely similar to what you first said. So here's the paradox. The lesson that both oral poetry and this children's game teaches us is that language, for all its power, is also fragile. That as it's passed along from person to person, words change, meanings change, we mishear what was said, or we don't remember it entirely, or we introduce new words that were never there in the first place. And this is exactly what happens to the Beowulf poem, except that it's not just a classroom full of kids on a school day afternoon, but tens of thousands of people over the course of hundreds of years. So that by the time that we get to the first millennium, the Beowulf story as it's told then differs significantly from the story that was first told in the middle of the 8th century. And that's the nature of oral poetry. It's one big game of telephone. And if we're going to think of Beowulf as a big game of telephone, we have to pay close attention to one particular development that was taking place in the island of Britannia as the game was being played. And that is the emergence of Christianity. As it turns out, this would have an immense impact on the Beowulf poem. In order to fully understand the Beowulf poem, we need to turn the clock back just a little bit to the beginning of the 4th century. It was then that the Roman Emperor Constantine issued a proclamation known as the Edict of Milan, which sought to promote religious tolerance throughout the empire. Now, the Edict of Milan was a general proclamation, but it was really meant for the Christians, who had been targets of persecution for over 2 centuries. Constantine himself was, for both personal and political reasons, increasingly sympathetic to Christianity, and he himself would eventually convert. The Edict of Milan had the effect of decriminalizing Christianity, and its implications were enormous. Over the next few centuries, Christianity would go from being a minor religion practiced in secret and fear to the most powerful and widespread religion that the continent had ever known. In the year 597, the Roman monk Augustine arrives on the island of Britannia. He's been sent there by Pope Gregory with the task of converting the pagan tribes, including the Anglo-Saxons, to Christianity. Now, there are two Augustines in history. The one that you've probably heard of is Augustine of Hippo. I think he gets some love in Western Civ and AP Euro. The Augustine that is sent to Britannia would become Augustine of Canterbury, the first Archbishop of Canterbury. They are two different guys living about 150 years apart, and you should do your best not to confuse them. Augustine arrives in 597, and his first prospect is an Anglo-Saxon king, King Ethelbert. Now, Ethelbert is the most powerful king in all of Anglo-Saxon Britain, and Augustine is able to convert him, perhaps because Ethelbert's wife, whose name is Bertha, was already a Christian. At any rate, when Ethelbert converts to Christianity, his subjects follow suit. Soon more Christian missionaries arrive, and as the word gets out that the most powerful king in Britain has converted to Christianity, more Anglo-Saxon kings and subjects do the same. Over the course of the next 4 centuries, Anglo-Saxon paganism and Christianity will come to coexist side by side on the island of Britannia. It is important to recognize that this process was a pretty complicated affair. The conversion to Christianity was rarely a clean break. Most converts continued to cling to the old ways, and others adopted only the aspects of Christianity that suited them. In some instances, a household might have one pagan spouse and one Christian spouse, and the children might be raised in both traditions. There was a lot of give and take, and most of it was messy, but one thing was clear. As the decades and the centuries wore on, more and more Anglo-Saxons were embracing Christian ways. So, as the pagan story of Beowulf is told and retold and retold again, many of the people who were telling that story were also hearing and then telling and retelling another story, the story of Jesus Christ. Eventually, the story of Jesus becomes intertwined with the story of the Beowulf poem, and as you read the poem, you will find plenty of instances where a pagan character thanks the Christian God, or praises Jesus, or where the poet marvels at how lucky the pagan characters were to have Jesus in their lives, even if they didn't know that Jesus exists. This may seem contradictory in a lot of ways, and it is, but it makes perfect sense if you just remember that the Beowulf poem is one big game of telephone. So after 3 centuries of oral transmission, after 3 centuries of being told and retold again, and the countless changes that occurred during that process, the poem is finally written down by 2 Christian monks sometime in the late 10th or early 11th century. So who were these monks? We have no idea. How do we know that it was 2 monks? Easy. About halfway through the manuscript, the handwriting changes. It's not clear what happened to the first monk. Did he die? Did he get bored and move on to something else? Did he leave the monastery entirely? We don't know. What we do know is that he stops transcribing the poem about halfway through, at which point another guy comes in and finishes the job. Now you may ask yourself, did these 2 monks add Christian elements to the poem? We don't know for sure, but it certainly does seem likely. However, because the poem was told and retold by an increasingly Christianized population for nearly 300 years, it seems reasonable to assume that many of the Christian elements were inserted into the poem well before it reached the monks, and that anything that they might have added was simply icing on the cake. The Beowulf poem exists in this single manuscript. If it weren't for those 2 monks, we would not have the poem at all. And when the second monk finishes the manuscript sometime in the late 10th or early 11th century, it was completely forgotten about for nearly 600 years. In fact, there is no record of the poem's existence at all until the late 16th century, at which time it is part of a private library. The manuscript was transferred to another, presumably safer library, but when this second library burned to the ground in 1731, it suffered considerable damage. In 1751, it was moved again, this time to the British Museum, where it was considered of very limited interest until well into the 20th century. Indeed, when anybody thought of the Beowulf manuscript, and believe me, very few people did, it was as a decrepit historical artifact of a savage people that had disappeared from the face of the earth long ago. Toward the middle of the 20th century, the general indifference toward Beowulf and the view that it was merely a musty relic from a dead warrior culture began to change for two reasons. The first factor that encourages people to appreciate the poem's artistic merits is a lecture by a man named J.R.R. Tolkien, whom you might know as the author of The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings trilogy. But Tolkien wrote those things for fun. He made his living as a professor of Anglo-Saxon poetry at Oxford. In the lecture, which was entitled Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics, Tolkien argued that Beowulf had rich characters and an intricate narrative structure and an exciting story to tell, that it wasn't just some random scrap of writing from a dark and distant past, but a compelling and complex work of art. Implicit in Tolkien's lecture was the idea that although Anglo-Saxon culture was a warrior culture, its people were a lot more artistically capable than most scholars thought. Tolkien's hypothesis that the Anglo-Saxons were capable of great art and that the Beowulf poem was an example of that great art was definitively supported just 3 years later in 1939 with the discovery of a burial ship, an Anglo-Saxon burial ship, at a place called Sutton Hoo in southeast England. Now, if you don't know what a burial ship is, listen closely, and I will tell you. In certain Germanic cultures, such as the Norse, the Anglo-Saxons, and the Vikings, when a king died, the people would take his body down to the sea and put it in a warship. And then they would fill the ship with treasure, with gold, and jewelry, and ceremonial war gear, shields and helmets and swords. And they would light the ship on fire, and they would set it out on the open sea towards the horizon, where the ship, and the treasure, and the king would be received by the gods. There are several variations of this practice, depending on the point in history and the exact geographic location of the tribe. But the most prominent variation involved taking the king's body, putting it in the warship, filling the ship with treasure, and then, rather than setting the ship on fire and sending it out to sea, burying the ship underground and building up the earth around it in what would come to be called a burial mound or a barrow. And this is exactly what happened to an Anglo-Saxon king in the late 6th or early 7th century. His barrow was part of a larger complex of burial mounds at Sutton Hoo that were excavated beginning in 1939. Upon opening the site, the archaeologists found that anything that was organic had almost completely decomposed. The hull of the ship, whatever else was made of wood, anything that was made of leather or wool or cotton, the king's body, all of these things completely or near completely disintegrated. In this computer graphic, you can see the impression that the hull made on the earth below it, a product of the sheer weight of the ship, which was 90 feet from tip to tail. Here is a photo of the archaeologists working at the site shortly after it was opened up in 1939. They're collecting the iron bolts that held the hull together. The bolts were badly rusted as the wood that surrounded them rotted away over the course of hundreds and hundreds of years. Now, although virtually everything that was organic had disintegrated, archaeologists were astonished to find that after over 12 centuries of burial, the one thing that had emerged from the site in perfect condition was the treasure. Here we see an Anglo-Saxon ceremonial war helmet, which had been placed near the king's head many hundreds of years before. What is immediately apparent is the extraordinary detail in the metalwork and the high degree of artistry involved in the overall production of the helmet. As one expert said, the level of craftsmanship of the treasures of Sutton Hoo exceeds anything of the sort to be found anywhere else in Europe.